If you've been weaving for any length of time, it's very likely that you have either already had a float or the inevitable will be that you will get a float at some stage. So today we're going to be discussing what a float actually is, and then I'm going to show you how you can fix it. Today's lesson is brought to you by the online weaving school. If you're looking to delve into your weaving or just get started on your loom, the weaving school is the perfect welcoming community for you. There are many single purchase classes available and different types of memberships as well. I'll leave the link to that down below. Okay, so let's first look at what is a weaving float. I've got a little bit of plain weave here that I've been doing. I'm going to show you the float in plain weave because that's the easiest fix. The fixes get a little bit more complicated if you have a more complicated pattern. So we're just going to start out gently with a bit of plain weave. So what can happen when you're weaving along is that you can actually accidentally skip some threads as you're weaving. Now, if you skip threads on the top layer, it's not really a problem because you can usually see that. Let me give you an example right here. So I brought my shuttle in and I've accidentally gone over a warp thread in the middle. Let's just weave that. Beat that in. And when I beat it, I can see quite clearly to me that I have accidentally gone over a thread there where I should have gone under it. And I can see that sitting on top of my work. It kind of sticks out. So all I have to do in that instance is just unweave it. Go back over the thread that I accidentally went over before to make sure that it doesn't catch. Unweave it and then reweave that shed. The problem with floats is that they mostly occur on the bottom layer, not the top. So you're weaving along quite happily. You get to the end of a long, potentially long project. You take a piece off the loom and you start looking it over, admiring your beautiful work, and then you turn over the back and you find that there are floats. And the floats can be any kind of length. They could be, let's do a long one to see what that looks like. So instead of just going over one thread accidentally, I will go over several, and that's really going to stand out. So let's have a look. Okay, so now you've got, it not only stands out visually, but you've also got something that is going to potentially snag, stretch, and look even worse than it did originally. I'll unweave that one again. So when these occur on the back of your work, you don't necessarily see them. In fact, most of the time you don't see them, and that's why they're a problem, and that's why we have to learn how to fix them. You don't come to it until the very end of your project, and then it can be kind of disappointing, but at least there is a way that we can fix it. So I'm going to talk first about reasons why floats could happen in the first place. The first one I think would be your warp tension is too loose. So what I'm going to do right here is loosen off my warp tension. Okay, so that's pretty floppy. Go into my shed. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's the up or the down shed, it can happen on either one. And I come in and I might just, especially if I'm a newer weaver and I'm not so familiar with how things are supposed to feel, I might just go, oh, I've just woven my pick, but did you see what actually happened there? I actually wove through threads in the bottom shed. So let's have another look at that. I just unwove it. So I was coming in, but because my warp tension is so loose, I accidentally went under some of the bottom threads where I should have gone over them. Let's have a look from the side angle just to be really clear on what is actually happening when this occurs. All right, so normally we just enter the shed and we weave right through, But because my threads are so loose, because I don't have that correct amount of tension, what can happen is I can come in and, oops, before I even know what's happened, the shuttle has gone under some threads that should be over. If I turn that on the edge, you can see that even more prominently what's happened there. And so I bring that through the shed, and then I beat, and from the front it doesn't look too bad. It depends where, you know, how trained your eye is to knowing what looks correct and what doesn't, but especially for a newer weaver, you just might not catch it. So everything looks sort of okay from the front and you keep weaving, but when you finish, okay, let's see if we can see this. When you've finished and you take it off the loom, you've got this gigantic float happening here. And often the float will not be as big as this. It'll be much more subtle, and so you'll be even less likely to catch it from the front. You won't be able to see what's happening, because if you just skip, say you've skipped over just one warp thread, it's really not going to be visible from the front. Okay, so another reason why a float might occur is because of the way that you are bringing your shuttle into the shed. So if you've done any of my classes, you'll be familiar with my techniques for entering the shuttle into the shed to avoid problems and to be able to weave in the best way. But basically, if you combine incorrect shuttle angle with a little bit of a floppy warp that's not tensioned properly, then that's going to make another problem. So let's say that you're bringing your shuttle into the shed and you're just going down here, like near the fell line. That's much more likely that you're going to snag or skip a thread. So snagging a thread's not ideal either, because you'll probably end up with stretched or snapped threads. But this will definitely make it more difficult for you to avoid having floats, because you're down here very close to the fell where there's a very, very small space. The shed is not very big there. The shed is at its biggest closest to the heddle up here. So that's where you want to bring your shuttle in. And also you want to avoid having your shuttle at some weird angle, like angled down or angled up too far. Anything that's going to sort of mess with your threads, you want to enter cleanly and go straight through that shed with a flat shuttle, and that just glides on through there and you're not going to have any problems. And then the last reason that I can think of for floats occurring is that your threads are really sticky. Now, I talk quite a lot about sticky threads. I've got a couple of videos talking about different yarns and so on. I will link to those down below if you want to check them out. But basically, if you have sticky threads, even a wool can do this. I'm using wool here at the moment, but it's not a particularly sticky one. You'll get to know which ones are more sticky or less sticky than others. This will happen a lot more with a more complicated pattern than plain weave, but it can still happen with plain weave. And also, especially if you're doing double width weaving in plain weave, you have to really beware of these sticky threads, because the threads that are going past each other constantly, sometimes they'll grab onto each other. If they grab onto each other, let's imagine I've gone into the up shed, but one of my down shed threads has kind of stuck to an up shed thread, so that what we end up with is this one that should be in the down shed right at the very bottom is now sort of sticking to the up shed, and you're not always going to notice that that has happened. You're going to then weave through the shed and oops, you have inadvertently skipped a bottom shed thread, and then you've got a float. So that's another reason for floats happening. Just one little tip for you while I'm talking about it is, if you have an extra stick shuttle or a pickup stick or something similar, is if you're having trouble with sticky threads, when you open up your shed, stick your stick shuttle or extra pickup stick or whatever it is in there and just clear out that shed, if there are any threads then sticking to each other, they're going to be forced back into their position. You can even do a little clear behind as well if your threads are particularly bad, like this, and that will really sort them out very quickly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to weave a little more of this plain weave, but I'm going to purposefully skip some threads so that I have a couple of different floats of different lengths that I can then show you and we can use to repair. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll do, for this one I'll just skip a single warp thread at the bottom. So that would be quite a small float. And then I'll just keep on weaving my plain weave. And I certainly don't want you to do floats on purpose unless you're doing, say, a sampler piece that you're not really going to use for anything, and you just want to have a practice of fixing floats for when you come across the problem later on. In that case, go ahead and make some floats on purpose. But otherwise, you don't actually want them in your work. So I'll do another one in a different spot. This time I'm going to make it, actually I'm going to make this one a gigantic one so that it really sticks out. And then keep weaving. And that way I can show you, you know, different ways, I can show you how using the same strategy for repairs can work, whatever the size of the float happens to be. Okay, so I'm just going to weave a little bit more. I will then take this piece off the loom and together we'll have a look at the technique for fixing. Here's my little piece off the loom. It is fairly easy to see from the front where I've put the floats in. And that's because my yarns are so contrasting. That's one thing I didn't mention before. Another way that floats can happen without you realizing is if your weft yarn is the same color as your warp yarn, then everything just kind of blends and it's really hard to see. If I turn over, you can see where the main floats are. So I've got one right here that's fairly lengthy. I've got a little one near the edge here. I've got a really little one here, right here, and that's my gigantic one. So how about we tackle the gigantic one first? You're going to need a tapestry needle and you're going to need a length of your weft yarn. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a different color. It's the same weight and the same type of yarn and everything as this one, but it's a different color, and I just want to do that just so that it shows up really well on camera for you what we're doing here. And then when I repair the other floats, I'll do them in green so that we can see properly how it's supposed to look. What I would be using is, I've got a tapestry needle here. It's just a metal tapestry needle. I usually use my gold Clover bent tipped needles. They are somewhere packed away in a box right now because we are in the process of packing up our house to move. So I couldn't locate them, but those are what I really recommend because the bent tip makes the action really easy. They're also a great thickness, and because they're gold, it's just really easy to see what you're doing. So if you're interested in those needles, I will leave a link to those down below too. So let's take our tapestry needle and our length of yarn. Okay. And what we want to do is start about an inch away from the float, and the float is going horizontal. We're also going to work horizontally. So about an inch away, we're going to follow this big float along to see what path it travels on as it goes along for about an inch away from it. Once we locate and we're sure we've got the right thread, and I can do that just by, if I tug that thread, I can see that it's this thread right here, that one. And so that's where I want to start coming in towards the float. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go into this piece of fabric following that particular piece of yarn that later becomes the float. So I've located it, I know which one it is, and I'm going to copy it with my needle. I'm going to follow the same path that it follows right up to the float. So for this thread, it goes over. So I'm also taking my needle over. For this thread, it goes under. I'm going to do the same. The next thread goes over. So this is a green weft thread going over the purple weft warp thread. The next one goes under, so I'm going to copy that as well. Next one over, then under. So what I'm basically doing here is plain weave with my needle. I'm copying what's already there. I'm copying the part that worked. Over, under, and that brings me to where the float begins. So where the float begins is where I'm going to continue needle weaving this line, not worrying about the fact that I'm not copying the same path anymore, because this thread went on its own path, and what I want to do is continue to mimic this path, which is the correct one. So you can just sort of pull your float out of the way while you focus on getting the correct thread. So I can see that the next warp thread right there, see that purple one? I need to go over it because I went under the last one. So going over. And then the next one is obscured a bit. The next warp thread is obscured by the mistaken thread, but I go under that because I'm following the right path. Okay. Next one is over, then under. This is where the bent tip needle comes in so handy if you have it, because it allows you to just kind of dig and rock back and forth. It's just so easy to use. And this one's a little bit trickier. Over, under, over, under, and I'm running out of needle now, so I'm going to start to pull that through. But as I pull it through, I don't want to pull the whole lot through. I want to leave a tail of a couple of inches. Okay, so just like that. Leave the tail hanging off, and don't worry about that for now. And then we'll go on. So we went under the last thread with the blue. So I'm going over and then under again. Over, under, over, under. Just keep repeating and following the path for what your thread should have done if it hadn't skipped those threads. I need to pull mine through again. I'll just pull that gently. I don't want to pull that tail through, and I don't want to pull it hard so that it's all puckering up. I want it just to sit as though it's just a part of the weft. Okay, almost to the edge. So last one I went under, so this one I've got to go over, and then under, and then out. And that finishes off where that float ended. So I'll also leave a tail there of a couple of inches. And I'm not going to touch those tails, and I'm not going to touch that long float until after I've wet finished. Now, I said I was going to also do some in the green weft yarn, as I normally would. Remember, the blue was just to make it really stand out to you what I was doing here. So now I'm threading up with some of my green weft yarn. Okay, don't put any knots or anything in it, that's not necessary. And then I'll have a look at which float I want to address next. So I think I want to do this one down here, which has skipped several threads. Okay, so I'm going to start once again around 1 inch away. Make sure I've got the right yarn, the right path. So it's this one right here. I'm going to come up and follow the same path. I'm going to leave a tail. And I'm going over, then over, under, over, under, following up. Okay, here I am at the very spot where the float begins. My last thread was under, so just pushing the float out of the way, it exposes what should have happened, and then I'm going to go over and under. I'm going to pull through my needle. Pull through the yarn, and then I can keep going. So the last thread I went under, so I'm going to go over the next thread, under, and then I'm following that thread out again, still doing over, under, till I'm 1 inch or so out, and then I can pull that through. Gently. Okay, and my float is back here. Then I'll cut the tail, leaving a couple of inches. Okay, we can look for another one now. There's a little one right here, just above the, should we call it the mega float? The mega float. All right, so locate that one. It's this one right here, right there. So I'm going to start by going over, coming under, and following the path towards the float. Just following the same path until I get to that float. And now I'm here. It's a little bit harder to see when your float is this small. Okay, it's harder to see, just kind of push that out of the way. But if you sort of angle things, you can still see underneath it in order to see enough what you're doing. So I went under, now I'm going over, under, over, and then I'm going to continue that out the other side. I need to pull through because my needle has gone all the way through. Alright, so leaving a tail again, and I'm just going to go a little bit further past that float. So last thread I went under, so I'm going over, under, over, under, and I think that will do it. And pull that through, and then I'll cut the tail, leaving a couple of inches. Okay, so it looks a little bit of a mess at the moment. We've got all these threads coming off and they're not looking too nice. But what we're going to do is, I've got another float over here, but I'm going to ignore that one because I've already done 3. That's probably enough for this video. I'm just going to focus on these. This is just a little sample piece, so I'm not worried if there's an extra float in there. So I'm going to take this and wet finish it. If you need to know more about wet finishing, I have a video on that also, which I will link to down below. So I'm going to go through the wet finishing process, leaving all these tails in place. I'm not going to touch any of this until this piece is completely dry. And when it is, I will meet you back here for the next part of the process. While we wait for my piece to dry, I would love for you to do me a great big favor. Would you please tell me beneath this video what kind of videos you would like to see more of on this channel? I'm all open to suggestions and I want to definitely make the kind of videos that you all would like to see the most. So be sure to take just a moment to leave me a comment down below with your suggestions. Thanks so much. My little sample piece is all dry, so I'm on the front side here. You can see where I went through with the blue weft. You can also see over here, it kind of stands out the float that I decided not to repair. So this is how it looks on the front, kind of stands out a lot more, and the rest of it looks fairly uniform now. If I go over to the back, I've still got the tails and the floats on the back. So the next job, once everything's completely dry, is to just trim off any tails with a sharp pair of scissors, being really careful not to cut your actual fabric. And also we can trim off the floats. So remember the gigantic float there, I'm just going to trim that flush with the fabric. I'm going to trim off any tails from the blue. I've got a tail on that side for that one, and over here. And I've also got, what have I got here? That little float that we also repaired there. I'm going to cut that away now. And down the bottom, I've got a tail there, and I can now get rid of that float right there. And over here is the one that I left for comparison. I already showed you what that looked like on the front. So that's our piece all repaired, looking fairly uniform now. Nothing stands out too much, which is great, and just what we want. You will also find a link to my blog down below where I will have a photographic tutorial of this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate all of your support so much. Till next time, happy weaving.